we are live on Us Property Investors. We bring the big games and we have the big fun. It is a huge session. We're talking about the property booms on the State of Origin free. So coincide. You have to pick. I would pick property over Origin, but maybe it's because I have to be on the session. But big with Haystack, we've got Matija. He is coming to us from on location in potential boom location. We won't reveal that. But we're going to throw some suburbs because I want to know where people want to unpack because we may have some time at the end. So put 500 suburbs and we'll cover about 3 or 4 maybe. But first off, Matija, how you going? What's happening?
Good, man. Good. Honestly, boys, thank you for inviting me. A pleasure. I thought I was going to have some issues when it comes to tech and all of that, so I hope it doesn't drop out. But I'm here in a boardroom of hotel. Can you see me properly? Everything's working. I got a new laptop, by the way, so I'm excited about that.
Oh, new laptop.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Look at you go.
The only issue that we might have is that, I constantly need to do these updates when you buy a new laptop, so it might just go off on me. If it does, I apologize.
That's why you need to get mad.
I mean to freak you out there.
All good. You got a new slightly slicker haircut as well. Are you growing it a little bit? It's
no, man, I'm not. I just got a haircut before I went on a holiday. Because I didn't want to look like a bush pig, as I would say. I was like working 24 hours a day for the last 2 months. So I said to myself, and you know what I'm realizing, by the way, for everyone who's building a business and wants to take a holiday, my advice to you is no, don't do it. Okay.
You have to do it. It's the only way.
I mean, you're on holiday right now and you're doing this live session, which is kind of like work for you. So I don't know. You know what it is? Like I constantly think that I'm slacking off. When I'm sitting next to the pool, I'm slacking off and I think I should be doing something else. And I'm realizing that I enjoy more working than actually being on a holiday, which just shows you how insane I am. But anyway, I think everyone that's in my position, I guess, feel this. I don't know about you, Joe, let's say, and you, Jeff, when you're building a business, do you feel the same or? Yeah, I don't.
But don't ask me. If I get too many things, I close off my books and I'm just like, no. If there's something, I'll work very hard when I need to. And then but anyway, Joe, how you going? Anyway, what's happening, man? You planning your holiday sort of haircut?
No holidays, no haircuts. Well, maybe I do need a haircut, but no, I'm pumped for this one because the funny thing is, like, you don't realize it when you're a semi-new investor. And when I say semi-new, I mean like 5 years in, because you've only just experienced, the most recent boom from the data perspective. And this is why I wanted to get you on, Matija, is talk about booms from a general perspective, from an overall perspective, because generally speaking, people know what a property boom looks like, right? Like they say, okay, cool, it's kind of coming off the boil, it's then stagnating, we then have this boom phase, we then have the euphoria, and then it starts to go back down, and then it goes back up. The good thing about property investing, over the last 30 years, every decade before, except for this period in Perth, property market was more expensive than it was the previous 10 years. So it's a very forgiving market, but being able to, like, everyone's like, time the market. It's timing the market, not time the market. And I think that's kind of old news now. There's a lot more data out there, and Matija, that's kind of what you're going to be talking about tonight. Why I wanted to get you on, because that curve that we talk about, that you see out there in the media, it's not reality at the end of the day, because that's what happens when you amalgamate and smush every single suburb into a general average. And you're not buying the average market. You're not buying the average state. You're not buying the average city. You're buying a property on a street which has its own market within it. So yeah, I'm pumped to talk property booms. It's a love that I have, because it's so uncomfortable buying in at the bottom. It sucks. It's annoying. Like, it just doesn't feel normal. But then you see people that are buying in at the top of the market, and you're just like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you buying? Just, take a little bit of caution. Anyway, that's why I'm pumped. Sorry, that was a bloody long.
So I guess, I love the topic. First, I would like to say I congratulate you both, and I thank you for saying my name perfectly. I think you're the only two men in the industry who attempt to say my name, and I really appreciate that. And it was actually perfect pronunciation. So thanks for that.
Don't say your last name though, please.
Djolic, but it's fine. Djolic, anyway, listen, if you're getting Matija right, that's it. It's all fine. By the way, I'm not precious. I don't really care. People can call me Matt, but I really appreciate what you're trying to do. So anyway, going back to the boom, I think it's a very important topic now. I think so. There is a couple of observations that you made before we dive into the areas. I just like to build the context and mention a few things.
Right.
Now,
before we do that, sorry, Matt, can I just introduce you? Because for those who are under a rock, sorry, just to make sure. So you are the head of research and co-founder at Hashtag, and you've got the data-driven insights to cut through that noise. You are a PhD. And you've got that mission to help the investors. So we'll show the platform at some stage, I'm sure. You're an author, though. You've got the PhD you've written, and I think several other publications, perhaps. You're an investment research coach and a mentor. So when do you sleep, I suppose? But doctor as well, Dr. Matija.
Yeah. It's funny that mentor bit at the end. I always dislike to say that. I mean, it's not. Listen, I don't mentor. I'm just very passionate about education. And I'm very passionate about looking at things from a different light, deep diving. My friends are very tired of me because, even when we're describing, a piece of furniture, I like to go a bit deeper, and they're like, oh, leave me alone kind of thing, So, I like to educate. That's my passion. And I think I've been analyzing data and collecting data for the last, I would say 15 years from my PhD, moving on to, let's say, Hashtag as well. So really passionate about that, let's say pattern recognition as well, which is essentially necessary for, even discussing this topic or anything else about property. I think pattern recognition, understanding, how to connect points or how to connect information into a narrative that sort of has logic. I think it's paramount for us to be willing to make a decision, and not only that, but increase the accuracy of it. So appreciate you introducing me. Regarding the topic that Joe, or today's topic, I just want to talk about it a little. Now, the first thing is timing. Okay. I do believe, coming back to pattern recognition, that I do believe we are in a position, or property essentially, I saw this, ad the other day, where it says, if you're trying to time the market, you're cooked. I think everyone knows what that ad is, but, I disagree with that, wholeheartedly. Now, when I say time the market, I don't inadvertently mean that we should trade property like we trade crypto and shares, in a sense that you buy and you sell within a year or anything like that. Because I think the beauty of property is taking account of, or leveraging compounding to build wealth. But I do think that you can time the market. And this comes back to the topic. I do think that you can time your entries within particular markets to leverage the upside, to take advantage of the boom, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the beautiful thing about why you can time the market is that property is an illiquid asset. So what I mean by that is that, it doesn't really exchange hands on a regular basis, meaning that, when you have established trends or patterns within, in a property market, they're sort of semi-enduring, and you can make a decision upon them. And in most of the instances, if you organize things in the appropriate way, they do eventuate, Now, finally, when it comes to the boom thing and what are the qualities of a boom, we'll see that when we look at different markets. But I can tell you that it's actually not as sexy as people would assume, And I use the term sexy because you would think that it's, something esoteric, something that only a few would have access to, all of these other things. We have to understand that growth in property is a simple equation: reducing supply, increasing demand, equals price growth. It is as simple as that. Now, when it comes to the notion of boom, i.e. exorbitant growth, and what is exorbitant growth? I mean, anything that grows in property 20% in 1 year, in a single year, and Perth was probably doing that, correct me if I'm wrong, for 3 or 4, even 5, that is phenomenal growth, okay? Anything above 10% is gonna, essentially what you need 7% in a decade for the asset to double, accounting for compounding, So, I mean, 20% is ridiculous. I mean, ridiculous in a positive sense. So if you want to experience those kind of returns, you still need to have a reducing supply and an increasing demand, but you need to have two other things. Very high levels of affordability for the area, for the suburb, okay? And you need to have very high socioeconomics relative to the price point. So what you're doing there is you're compounding a trifecta, I would say. You have favorable supply and demand dynamics where supply is scarce, demand is increasing. You also have property that's extremely affordable, and you have affluence or dry powder sitting on the sidelines, i.e. the suburbs, residents actually have sufficient money to pay for the house. And not only that, but it's a wealthy suburb. Now, what you're doing there is you're creating enormous momentum. So let's say if you have supply scarcity, this means that in those areas, in those contexts, even small increases in demand lead to large material changes. You essentially, people just start, flowing in, and FOMO is happening essentially from the onset. Now, when I say FOMO, I mean fear of missing out, in a sense that you're overpaying for the asset and people can increase by 20, 30 grand and somebody's going to be there lining up to pay for it. But this is because you have those very high levels of affordability. And any suburb that you look at in the last 5 to 10 years, or any area, which we'll discuss later, you'll see that it had those attributes. It actually had those attributes. And now when we're forecasting further, there are certain locations and suburbs that again have those attributes.
Oh, there we go.
How do you think about this from a macro perspective? So, like, you hear it a lot, like areas do grow independently of each other, but they are bound together by like Sydney boomed from 1996 to 2004, and then had a peak from 2002 to 2003. Over 8 years, it went up 100%. So there's like these periods of growth. But that's Sydney. But now when someone says, should I buy Perth? You hear all this stuff like, oh my gosh, don't buy Perth. Don't buy all of WA right now. Like, how should we be thinking about it from a city and a macro perspective before we dive kind of into the micro?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer, and correct me if I haven't understood your question, but now what you're talking about is, okay, if something that has grown substantially, does it still have steam, essentially? Is that what you're asking for? And how do we determine that? Is that the question? Because you're referring to a macro perspective. Now, what you're saying is that if something has grown substantially for X amount of years, does that mean we should stay away from it? And how do these cycles move, from one state to another? Yeah? Is that the question? Yeah. So there's two parts to the question. Now, first, you do see cyclical movements between states, Now, how is that determined and why? Again, it comes down to, a perfect storm which produces this, amalgamation of high levels of affordability, reducing supply, increasing demand, and very high affluence in the area. Like, for example, for Perth, you saw stagnation of about 10 to 15 years, You saw the same for Townsville. Okay. Now, when you have
we're seeing the same for Darwin now, or is Darwin
correct? Which is why I said there are certain areas that are having the same indicators which we're talking about now in the future, and Darwin is one of them. Not all Darwin, but just only some. But anyway, we can get to that. So, what I wanted to say is that it was stagnating for long periods of time. And what a stagnation in price growth produces? It produces high levels of affordability. I mean, if you're considering that within those 10 to 15 years, wages were increasing, obviously not at a rampant rate in Australia, but they were still increasing, especially in areas that are highly affluent or have a very high socioeconomics. So what you see is that the purchasing power of residents is improving while the property is plateauing or stagnating, not going anywhere. Essentially wasn't going anywhere, which means that inadvertently every year that goes by, you see an improving affordability, i.e., why should I be renting when I can buy, essentially? You see the yields approaching a certain level, and then you realize is that, what you pay for rent is actually more expensive than you owning a house. And why wouldn't you own a house when you can buy it, essentially? So, you see that happening, and that's why now, why do cycles happen, or why do cycles occur? Nothing is perpetual. There's nothing goes on indefinitely. In the same way that, stagnation wasn't indefinite, so too will not be, growth or hotspot within Perth will not be permanent. Everything moves through cycles. Why? Because you reach those certain levels of, higher levels of unaffordability. You see the owner-occupier cohort dropping off, which is then followed by the investor cohort dropping off. The price starts subsiding and people start looking in other states or other areas where they can afford the property more to invest into. Now, I'm speaking about investors looking in other states, The same also works when it comes to owner-occupiers. For Melbourne, you saw price stagnation. Now, not for 10 or 15 years, but you saw maybe for 2 or 3, which is what sort of took, essentially a little bit off the top to make it more affordable for people to buy. In Melbourne, you have now GCC regions where you can buy an 800K, 4-bedroom house. Sydney, you have to drive 70 kilometers to get that. So essentially,
GCC region. So those who have not heard what a GCC.
Greater capital city. Bottom line is, to answer the question, is that because everything moves in cycles, but these cycles are underpinned again by the same dynamics, in a sense that something stagnates for long periods of time and then it becomes affordable and people can purchase it, and then owner-occupier demand starts increasing. When owner-occupier demand starts increasing, if there's supply scarcity, and by the way, supply scarcity is essentially anywhere across Australia these days. You see small increases in demand leading to price growth, then you see investors migrating to the market, then both cohorts start competing for the same asset, then you see exorbitant price growth. And then it reaches a point where it becomes a little bit unaffordable. One of the cohorts starts dropping off, then the other one, then you move on to the next sort of state. Now, second part to your question was this.
Yeah, the state due to affordability and supply and demand, right? Because that's the thing that people get excited. Like I'm seeing it in the media right now, like as Perth has been, it's now the hot spot. It's now the place to go. And it's like, we're not buying it all in Perth. Like it doesn't make sense from an affordability aspect, but this is exactly what the sequence has followed over the past 30 years, where there is a hot market like Sydney. And then, well, actually, I don't know, maybe I might get my my iPad out, Jeff. And
you unplugged it. But yeah, so what I was going to say, while Joe sorts himself out and gets his tech sorted, I want to know.
Let me, Jeff, if you don't mind, I just want to say one thing, and which Joe pointed out, which I think is very important to mention. Now, there's usually this narrative that states that if something has grown in the past, it will not grow in the future. Now, the assumption that's being made there is that future growth is determined from past growth. Okay, so if something has grown 50% in the last 5 years, that means it will not grow into the future. Now, that's completely incorrect, because growth happens from supply and demand. What might happen is that you might have an area, and one of these areas has been voted for in the group to be discussed. You can have an area that has grown 50% in 5 years and yet still has a reducing supply and an increasing demand, which means that it will continue to grow. Now, the question is for how long and how much. Of course, that needs to be determined. But just because Perth has grown X amount, it doesn't mean it will not grow into the future, especially if it has a reducing supply and an increasing demand. The question is, okay, how much growth does it have left? Townsville, for example, has generated 100% growth in 7 years, okay? Which means that just a year ago or 2 years ago, I wouldn't have invested in Townsville if I used that same thesis, i.e. 50% growth in 5 years. So
you would have missed out on 50% of capital growth.
Correct.
However, it is an indicator where it's like, well, how far can it go? And then that's when it comes into the bigger question of, well, what's driving that fundamental growth? What infrastructure is set up? What is actually changing the supply and demand dynamics? And is that still going? Is it still happening? And other people that are moving to that area wealthy? It's kind of like if all of Sydney just decided to move to Brisbane, all of Melbourne, right? All of Melbourne decided to move to Brisbane. Would Brisbane be more expensive than Melbourne? Well, it actually is right now. You can't buy within 30 minutes of Brisbane for $600,000. But it's like
those medians are poor though, because that median measures the dwelling price. So you've got, if you look at the house price, Melbourne still has a more expensive house price than Brisbane. Because Melbourne's still over $1 million for house prices. It's got all those units that skew Melbourne down to some extent, and it considers it. But anyway, you got your iPad ready, or do you want to show something?
No.
Okay, no. What I wanted to know because we need to get into. He was so excited about it.
I was excited about it, but it's not working.
So we will talk about. I want to contrast the Onkaparinga region of Adelaide versus the Townsville LGA. So we'll get to that, because then that'll start to leave some clues, and then we'll start to talk about some more things about the characteristics. We have sprinkled those through. But first, Matty, I wanted to say, first off, with capital growth and owner-occupiers versus investors, is it like, given that 70% of owner-occupiers are in that market, can you then sort of say that it's largely still booms are driven by owner-occupiers first, or is it the investors? Like, who kind of, have you got information on that? Or is that
yeah, absolutely. Now, two times larger lending cohort is the owner-occupier cohort in compared to investors. Okay,
yep.
So that means sorry?
How much money does that mean? How much loans are getting?
Yeah, so essentially 2/3 of purchasing happen by owner-occupiers.
Yep.
Massive. And also they're the ones making
no.
emotional.
And I'm talking about across Australia. Yeah. Now it might vary on the basis of a particular region. What I'm trying to say is that, it is mostly the owner occupiers who obtain loans and actually purchase property, which is why you only have X amount of, how many, 2 million investors in Australia. Not everyone is. So bottom line is what I'm trying to say is that, this comes back to the affordability question. Okay, so when you speak about affordability, you speak about affordability within that particular suburb or that particular region, which is going to ignite the demand or the purchasing patterns. Okay, and it is mainly every time you see an area that has turned into a hotspot, it usually starts with owner-occupiers trying to purchase property, and they're driving that initial wave of demand. Okay, you usually see that now, especially because investors are relegated to different price points. Now, most of the times, and Joe can confirm this, I mean, in the last 100 briefs that I've received, I would say over 95, let's say between 95 to 97 for a price point that's below 600K. Okay, so investor participation is very rare in price points that are above 600 or 650K. Okay, you have here and there essentially, those investors participating in market, but it is rare. Bottom line is, even in markets that are below 600K, it is mainly the owner occupiers who are beginning the purchasing, which is essentially moving the area of the needle from 0% growth in a year to, let's say, 5, 7, 10. When you're hitting the 5 or 7% mark to the 7 or 10, you already have competition between owner occupiers and investors. Now, the beautiful thing or the interesting thing about it is when an area reaches a bubble territory, what you usually do see at the back end is that mainly the investors are purchasing. Owner-occupier demand has dropped off, and you see the investor saturation there, which is manifest as very high vacancy rates and both increasing short-term and long-term trends. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, it is anyway the owner-occupiers that are buying most of the homes, okay? So that's a given, which is why the affordability and the affluence of that specific suburb is one of the primary factors which drives not only the initial birth of price growth, but prolonged price growth as well. So yes, the area needs to be primarily affordable for the owner occupiers first to see that trickling in of initial demand into the suburb.
So that's what, when people say, oh, I was looking at the data and, oh my gosh, this place is starting to move. Well, it's like the reason is it's not going to be it's very tough to get it investor led unless you've got, hundreds of deals sent through to a market.
Maybe.
What are your thoughts on that, Matija? What we've got, like, people, like, one of the thing is with investors now, and this is the thing I haven't really heard spoken about too much, is what happened. I think we even mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, Jeff, I know we're going off topic here, but there used to be just a shotgun spread of investor activity. Everyone would hear, they'd be chatting to their mate at the barbecue. What's happened now, it's gotten a lot more concentrated where people are a little bit more sophisticated. So rather than shotgun spread out to 20 different regions, they're now narrowed into 5 different regions and spread out. How do you think that concentration starts to affect the market and the data and those sorts of things? Is that a concern? Is that a thought?
You think concentration of, the general narratives that are being discussed, how does that shape demand? Is that what you mean? Or
I just mean that there's a lot less. I see a lot more sophisticated investors, smarter investors that have access to, like your platform, for instance, incredible platform, access to supply, demand, vacancy rates, understanding of the macroeconomics and the microeconomics of a region. And then what that does is you spend an hour on there, you're like, cool, I've got some good understanding about this. But then, how does that interact with the market itself?
So that's actually a very interesting question. Now, there is a notion that's called in equities and crypto called exit liquidity. Okay. Now, what exit liquidity means is that it means, let's say, let's discuss hedge funds. So what hedge funds do is let's say they invest in a certain stock or asset class before everyone else because they're sophisticated and they do the research. And then the exit liquidity for them is the retail investor that catches on too late. So what that means is then us three, we hear about something about Bitcoin or about a real estate trust or wherever it is, you know what I mean? And we start buying when everyone catches on, the smart investor is out. So when everyone is catching on, we are all of us that are catching on at the tail end. We are the exit liquidity for the sophisticated investor. Ooh. So what that means is that now, if everyone is talking about a suburb, and you can actually see that, you can see a lag in Perth, for example, for about a year. Now, sophisticated investors were in Perth 4 years ago. Then the longer you go towards, or the closer you come towards the current time frame, the sophistication fades of that investor, which means that we mainly start relying on the actual narratives, social media campaigns, etc., without actually putting any pen to paper, essentially, to figure out what we want to invest into. Now, does that shape price growth? Absolutely, which is why you have the whips at the tail end. So what usually happens is that, you do have, this is a bit of a dark subject, but, let's say people who suffer from terminal illness, what usually happens is that they feel extremely better a couple of days before they pass away. Yeah. Now this is that kind of a phenomenon, you know what I mean? So it's the same thing for property price growth. You see very sudden bursts at the end and you're thinking, oh shit, it's going through another top, or it's going through another boom, when that's just the exit liquidity of everyone starting to pile in because they're hearing online narratives. The smart investor was out a long time ago, not only out or sitting on the sidelines. I'm not suggesting that you need to sell off property. So bottom line is, yes, you can shape demand, but I don't think it's infinite and it's long lasting.
What are some of those? That's super interesting. What are some of those things that we need to consider when we're reaching the top? Like, what are some of the telltale signs that, hey, you start to get a little bit worried here? Like, what are those?
So I did actually a presentation on this in our mastermind. I think it's a very relevant topic. I think I did, when you should know you should exit a hotspot. And there are a couple of signs. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is lower levels of socioeconomics respective to the price point. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Yeah. Well. Let's say if you have an ERSAD score in the area that is 1 or 2 out of 10, which is disadvantageous. Now, by the way, ERSAD, for people who are listening, it is an ABS metric, which is a relative index of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. It has been developed by ABS using 20 different or 30 different sub-parameters. It is actually a very, very interesting, complex, and relevant metric to consider, So essentially just wrapped under one banner, socioeconomic index of advantage and disadvantage. So score of 1 or 2 are disadvantageous areas, socioeconomically disadvantageous. Anything above, let's say from 3 to 8 is neutral, and then 8 above is advantageous. Bottom line, if you see an area that is hovering around the 700K typical price, and yet it has an ERSAD score of 1 or 2, you should essentially consider exiting. Now, why? There is
not mincing words there though. You're just saying, no, that's it, done.
I'll tell you why no. Now that area might go to 850, but will the 700 turn into 1.4 million? No. And I'll tell you why. There is 0% chance, and I say zero. I was saying about a year ago 0.34% because I was doing the research, but this research is actually adjusted now. So there's 0% chance that an area that's 700K in typical value will reach 1.4 million with an ERSAD of 1 and 2. Go on any platform, go on any database, look at an area, allow for high confidence data set to make sure that what you're looking at is correct. Look at the last decade of growth and set it at greater than 100%, and then see what the areas that are listed, what ERSAD they have. The lowest one is 3. Most of them have ERSADs of 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so that's the first thing. Okay,
so we want to go. So essentially, what that's saying is go to areas where there's people that can afford to keep pushing up and rising up the prices.
This is why ERSAD.
This is why that score is so important.
Yeah. And is ERSAD updated at the same time? Sorry to interrupt. We just had a really good question from Kelly. She said, "Is that updated every 4 years as well, or is that
correct?" Correct. Now let me just frame that. Usually people would say, every 4 years, and usually people talk about ERSAD in the context of the notion of gentrification. And I think I've discussed this actually on this show before. Now, gentrification assumes that the economic underpinning of the area shifts and changes. Yes, it does happen. Now, lucky for us, ABS has also published research about changes in ERSAD, and that research is also available on our website in an Excel spreadsheet format. and I can share it with you guys. You can distribute it. It's free, I think. You can distribute it to your community. Even if it's not free, I'll share it with you guys and you can give it to your community, okay? And you'll see.
What does that mean? Like what have they done? They've just
they've actually looked at the changes of ERSAT across time since they started recording ERSATs.
Right. So, okay. And then that's going to give you a bit of a scope to say 4 years matters. It's going to be a massive difference. Or 4 years doesn't really matter. It's going to take time for these areas to move and change.
ERSAT, in order for you to see a socioeconomic change in an area, it takes decades, not decade, plural, decades. Not only that, when you see a change, it changes by a score of 1. Not only that, most of the changes happen at the lower end or the upper end of the spectrum, i.e. the 1s and 2s at the 8, 9s and 10s. So even if you have a change, you would jump from 1 to 2. You will not jump from 1 to 7 or from 1 to 4.
Didn't happen. Is Redfern an exception though? Have we looked at Redfern? Sorry, I just wanted to. I'm an awkward guy who starts mentioning. No, I haven't looked.
Yeah, but Redfern. I mean, what has changed about Redfern, man? When was the last time you drove through Redfern?
Yeah, I walk through Redfern at least around once a year to get to the cricket. Going through.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably there was a shift, and you have a couple of better buildings and all of that. It is changing. You're right. Good point. I haven't looked at Redfern. I'll check and I'll let you know. But I can tell you this, that the changes really jump 1 or 2 steps. Now you'll be surprised that how ABS actually records ERSAT. Doesn't matter what you think has actually changed. It's probably made a leap of 1. Not a leap of 4.
But I guess
what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't change across time. To answer I don't know the name of the person who's actually which is why it actually matters. It actually matters what the ERSAT is at the point of purchase. So coming back to Joe's question, if it's very low, extremely low socioeconomics for a price point at 700K and above, that is a concern. Now, will it go to 800 or 900? I don't know, but I work in the context of probability. Is there a higher or lower probability that this area will grow in value further in the future? No, there's a lower probability because of that friction point that's been set. So that's the first thing that I consider, okay? The second thing that I consider now, we have to wave them into a narrative and connect them into a logical relationship. Now, the second thing that I consider is also affordability respected to the price point. If you have, and by the way, different people measure affordability in different ways. We have, an affordability index called years to own, i.e. how long does it take to pay off a house within this suburb on the base of medium income, okay?
And just to go back to that point of the ERSAT, because I want to make it clear that buying
we've got to get to Adelaide, Townsville, and then so we're
buying in at a 1 and 2 is not necessarily a bad thing, right? No. If you're buying it at an affordable price, that's what Matt is saying here.
No, absolutely, Joe. Well done. Now, what also ERSAT doesn't play a dominant role if you're investing in price points that are 550 and below. Why? I mean, common sense dictates because you're entering a lower price zone, you're already entering an area that's socioeconomically disadvantaged. Okay. Are there many areas with an ERSAT score of 1 and 2 that have seen 100% growth? Yes, there are many areas, but most of them, when they hit that friction point of 700, they essentially struggle or have less steam thereafter. But if you're investing in 550 and below, you are bound to be dealing with low socioeconomic areas, and they shouldn't be discounted at all. Absolutely, yeah. So, thanks for that, Joe.
So now, affordability, that's the next kind of pillar, the next pillar to all of this. So how should we think about affordability?
Yeah, so affordability, the way we think about it at HTAG is essentially the way we calculate. The index is typical price, current cash rate plus 2%, RBA cash rate plus 2% buffer, 80-20 LVR, and 50% of your medium income's going towards mortgage repayments, not 30-50, okay? So it's like a mortgage stress indicator, okay? Now, what we've realized is that affordability index, so its preference changes. I mean, you can set it at a hard line of 30 years to own because the mortgage term is 30 years, but it's different in Double Bay than in, some areas that are 550K and below. Now, this
in my
I mean, it does change. So the affordability index for price points that are below 550 And by the way, one of the areas, Onkaparinga and let's say Townsville, for example, what classifies those on what happened in Perth as well is these areas had a very, very low affordability index for their price point. So they had an index of close to 20 years to own, which now is extremely rare. There's only Darwin that has that. There's no other area with an affordability index of 20 years to own. So what I'm trying to say is that usually for price points that are 550K and below, you see an index between 25 and 35, okay? For price points that are, or you should be looking at that range at least, you know, to have some kind of short-term and long-term thing. For areas that are between 550 and 850, you should be looking between under 40, sorry. So, I mean, if you can get 31, it's great, but the problem is the more you're restrictive on the index, the more you're sort of narrowing your shortlist. So you have to make certain compromises, and there are ranges for the compromises as well. Bottom line is what I'm trying to say is that if I see an area, let's say Dallas in Victoria, okay, which some people are talking in context of good investment location, it wouldn't be for me. Why? Because Dallas has an affordability index of 50 years to own for a price point that's 550.
Yeah,
you know,
that doesn't get me all that excited. So it's just not, the incomes there just aren't there to support, to see that price growth increase.
Exactly. And now, guy, and this is what I always say to everyone, like when I do strategy sessions and coaching sessions, I go, you got to start thinking, you have to rewire your brain, and you have to think about the notion of probability. You can't, a lot of people say, yeah, but if it's very unaffordable for its residents, it doesn't mean it's not going to grow. Absolutely, it doesn't mean. But there's a higher probability that it won't in comparison to another area that's more affordable and has all the other boxes ticked as well, you know? So this is, when you start speaking about probability, you're sort of forcing your user or whoever you're trying to educate, you're forcing him to actually compare and consider it in the context of other purchases under the same brief. So when you start bringing up
some of this, sorry to sort of, you're in a good state.
I need to, let me just give the nugget. So that's number 2. Number 3 is increasing weakening short-term demand. Okay. You usually see that as a rising trend in days of market. And number 4, now you can have all 4, by the way, or you should have at least 2 or 3. Number 4 is increasing vacancy rates, both short-term and long-term trends. That indicates oversaturation with investors. So that's very important to consider, guys. Anyway,
okay.
Going back to
can you give us the 1, 2, 3, and 4, because you said it was a lot.
Low socioeconomics respective to the price point. Yeah, okay. So this is
when you're peaking a boom, right? This is when we start to say, look, this boom's starting to get unaffordable and difficult. Okay, sorry, mate.
Yeah. So you pick affordability index that's above 3 usually. In most instances, they should be above 3, but even above 5 in some instances, out of 10, of course. Then you're picking areas that are extremely affordable. Again, everything is relative to the price point. The index, the socioeconomic index, as well as the affordability index. Make sure you're picking areas that have severe supply scarcity established, both long-term and short-term, and make sure you have areas that have, improving vacancy rates dropping both long-term and short-term, which means that rents will be increasing. And if the area hasn't boomed already, rents will come to a point where it becomes more sensible to own than to rent. And then you see that essentially demand for rentals shifting to the demand for ownership, you know what I mean? So you see a reduction in the days on market. Anyway, that's essentially, I don't know whether, I can do a bit of a narrative about this and send it to you guys, but those are the things that I start looking at from the onset, and you'll see that in all of these areas, by the way.
Well, one random question that I have, and I'll shut up so Jeff can ask his one question, is when we've got an area that's $750,000 of typical price, and we're buying a property at $600,000, and the affordability is very high. How should we think about that in our heads as a property investor? So
you're buying a property that's 750?
No, 600, and the typical price, because then all the charts are based off that 750 data, right? You're basing the affordability off that 750, where you're buying under the median value, under the typical value. How do you factor that in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, if it's that far off, I will first ask why. That's the first thing that I will consider. But what you want to do is you want to compound good decision making. So just because, let's say you're buying in an area that has 750 typical price, Okay, but that area is unaffordable. It's hitting the unaffordability threshold. Yes, you will buy a property that's of lower price, more affordable, but the area in and of itself doesn't have a lot of steam. Remember, your growth is going to be generated from comparable sales. So yes, your property that you bought at a lower end will increase to the higher end sooner rather than later, and then it will struggle from that point on because the comparables will drown it. Yeah. Now, what will be great is if you buy in an area that's 750, and yet even that 750 is extremely affordable for its residents, but you've managed to source an asset of 650, for example. That's like you're compounding good decision making. Essentially, you're giving it a lot more steam, and that is a great way to. I always talk about this compounding of good decision making. That's always a great. I mean, if you can find a great asset in a great location, you can essentially just put your feet up, and you'll sleep at night for the next decade, and you'll double your money, and that's great. In most instances, you can't really compound good decision making that way, but if you can, phenomenal. Make sure though, don't assume that just because you found a very affordable property, if you're buying in an unaffordable area, sooner or later you're going to hit that friction point in the short term anyway, because your one will pump to a level where everything equalizes, and then it will struggle to move from that point on.
Yeah, it's all relative, right? A 4-bed, 2-bath at 850, typical price is, let's just say 750, and you're buying a 3-and-1 at the bottom end that needs work at 600. The market is all going to move within relative to the asset type that you purchased, right? So when you see that, that's how to think about that. Jeff, I'm going to shut up.
Yeah, it's just because we haven't even talked about Anyway, okay.
Okay,
we'll squeeze it in.
Let's throw the first ad, and we'll come back and we'll talk about Adelaide and Townsville, which is going to take. Yeah, anyway, we'll throw the first ad.
Oh, Jeff, I wish there was 3 investing books that covered everything property.
Oh, Joe, there is. Steve has 3 books now.
That I do, guys. I've got 3 books now. You probably don't even have to follow this group anymore. Just kidding. You want to keep seeing and hearing from me, of course, so stay involved. But in all seriousness, if you want to get the full picture of investing, residential, commercial, and development, these 3 books have you covered for the fundamentals. For OzProp members, here's the best part. I'm giving these books to you for free. Just cover the postage and I'll send them right to your door. Go to policeyproperty.com or click the link below and get your copies today. You can also get all my spreadsheets, checklists, and resources free on my website. Happy reading, gang.
Okay, well let's get through this because we've got about 40 so minutes, and got questions in there as well. So I want to because that we started it actually YouTube started strong after. So the Facebook was right. So anyway, it doesn't matter.
You're wasting time now, mate. Who's wasting time now?
Not wasting time.
Let's do it.
So Matija or Onkaparinga in Adelaide. What do we sort of let's actually show people what it looks like.
Do you guys see my screen?
Words out.
Yes.
It's great. I'm just like, if I'm listening.
I want to see the goods, is what Jeff is saying. Yes, we can see your screen now, so we can see Onka. So can you just zoom out a little bit on that map just to show us where that sucker is, just so we've got a little bit of context to where.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're in South Australia. Adelaide's there in the middle there, and Onkaparinga is south of the city, about 35 minutes out, depending on.
Basically Morford Vale Way, you got Christie's Beach, you got all that sort of
Christie Downs, Hackham, and then it gets very regional, like lots of land out there as well. Cool. Okay, rock and roll. What are we talking about here?
What is the sign of this boomed? That's what we want to know.
Yeah, so let me just, what I did is I looked at all this. So we got 39 entries here. I just want to see quickly high confidence data. So in the last what are the growth? So look at it. So in the last decade, you see a lot of areas generating over 150%, which is, essentially substantial. If you go down and look at it, sorry?
What's the worst performer of that? So you've got 10 years, 100. Look at that. Oh, no.
101 is the worst.
101 versus 150. So anywhere in Onkaparinga over the next 10 years.
Flagstaff Hill, which is a more I'd say Earthside would be pretty high in that area, probably.
Yeah, I think it's
more
top.
Yeah.
So if we look at the Earthsides, so most of them, so you have 1, then 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, then you got 3 is the rest, and then you got 9. Rest are bigger, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah, it is. There is super affordable markets in here, and this is why you can't look at the medium. You can't just say, well, Onkaparinga's Earthside is 7. Well, it's like, no, there's 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, and 1, 1, 1.
What is interesting is the one that's 566, okay, which is why the Earthside is lower. It's a 2. The 566 has increased 150 in the last decade.
That's so good. That's the market we were buying in.
So that goes to your observation. For example, if you're investing under 550 and you have a lower Earthside, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't play a big role. You can still have areas experiencing such a growth. But for example, this area will hit a major friction point from this point on because of the lower socioeconomics.
Yeah, it's right now.
Yeah. But if we go down and look at the typical price, so what we see the pump essentially starting anywhere around 2020, essentially. So, I mean, it was before that, you can see a bit of compounding happening. It was growing. So, growing from 227, and we're talking about the LGA now, yeah? So, in an aggregated manner from the LGA perspective, so he started in 2007 at 272K, then he went up to 443K, but that point on, and it took essentially from 207 to 220. So it took 3, that's 10. It took 13 years, to increase from 272 to 443.
About a roughly 30%, or not even that. Probably like you're lucky 20 to 30% growth over.
And then from that point on, it went from 439 to 855.
Well, this is the interesting thing about Adelaide itself, really. Like, it doesn't boom often like it has in the past number of years. Like, it doesn't go absolutely gangbusters. When Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane start to get really affordable, that's when Adelaide starts to experience things, when things start to get more, like, it becomes more attractive. Now, that isn't typically what happened in the most recent boom. It all kind of grew together because of the COVID. But it is an interesting thing, right? Like, Sorry, go on.
So Adelaide, for example, in the last decade, so you see that the return of this region in the last 10 years has been 115%. In the last 7, it has been 100%. Last 5, 89. Last 3, 30. And then last year, it started dropping off less than 10 in a year. So 766. You see it's losing steam a little now, yeah? But it's been pumping for a decade, essentially, And if you look at, for example, we'll get to a few things, but I just want to show you something. So let's say if you look at growth pattern deviation, which essentially measures the growth of the area in comparison to itself across different time frames. So it measures the growth in the last 3 years to 3 years before that, in the last 5 years to 5 years before that, and then in the last 10 years to 10 years before that. The reason why these values are red, i.e. it's negative, it means that in the last 3 years, it has grown 22% more than 3 years before that. In the last 5 years, it has grown 72% or 73 than 5 years before that. And then in the last 10, nearly, 29, then 29% than 10 years before that. So the last
what does that tell you?
It means that it's been growing. It's been
probably
booming. It's been booming for the last decade. It's been booming long periods of time. Okay, and if you look at this area, for example, so last decade from 2025, so 2015, so we'll be about here, and you see it started accelerating, and then it just sort of popped up and went off. Now, when I said to you before, in order for this to happen, this region has an Earthside score of 5, which is average, and in 2020, when it really started popping off, which go back to typical price, it's 2020 when this essentially, turn or, happened. Like, it started increasing phenomenally higher after this point, after 2020. You see Earth out of 5, and yet the affordability, it was 18.3 years to own back then. Now, just to put it in context for you, for people who are listening,
Massive.
you will not find an area that's that affordable anywhere in Australia. When I say anywhere, I mean 18.3 years. When I say an investment grade area, okay, you'll find Mount Isa in Queensland, but I would never invest there. So investment grade stock, you will not find investment grade stock in Australia that's this affordable with such a high sort of socioeconomics. When I say high, 5 is neutral, but it's practically, very high.
Solid.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, it's a solid value. So it's now getting to that super unaffordable. So should we be like, I guess you're saying no market is at 20 now. So what should we be looking out for now as like, okay, cool. Well, we can't buy in at the 20 affordability. Like, what should we be buying in at?
Yeah,
in this market? Where is the value?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say to people that, market is shifting, and sometimes we have to just absorb or take what the market gives us. I get a lot of people come to me and say, listen, I want the next birth, I want this, I want that, or, just because something has returned 100% in 5 years, it doesn't mean that you will always be given that opportunity. Okay. Now you should find the fastest horse relative to the circumstance that you're in, but that fastest horse might not be, 20 or 30% annually. It might be just 7 or 8, or it might be 5 or whatever, as long as it's the fastest horse. Now, 5 is the Australian average. You should always be investing in areas that give you more than that. But what I'm saying is that it is still the same play. It is still very high levels of socioeconomics, very high levels of affordability, restricting supply, increasing demand, but it's not going to be the affordability index of 18 years to own. It might be at the affordability index of 25 or 30, respective or relative to that price point, which means that no, it will not give you 100% growth in 7 years, the area they're investing in now. It might give you 45, but guys, 45 return on a leverage asset, 45% is still a phenomenal return, especially if you're
also 40% on 500,000 is 200,000, right? Versus 100% on 300,000 is roughly not exactly the same. It's a little bit more.
We have been, and this is what Joe has alluded to. Now, this is the growth rate cycle, and you see the pump from 2019. So it was at the bottom. Now, these are all of the LGAs within Onkaparinga region, okay? So just imagine that it sort of morphs into one. So we see growth rate cycle highlights, the rate of growth that the area has experienced, So you see the rate of growth increasing phenomenally, essentially from 2019 or 2020, as I said, onwards, and it started sort of tapering off now. Now, what is interesting about this, region here, or this area on the graph, is that it does coincide with COVID. Okay, it does coincide with free money, or not free money, but easy access to money, easy access to funds, money,
massive amounts of savings.
Yeah, massive amounts of savings. All of these things coinciding, which produces this exorbitant growth. Now, we don't macroeconomically live in such conditions anymore, or at this point at least. Which means that, generating, what was the point? 29% was the top point of growth for one of these areas in 2021. So you might not get 30, but you'll get 12, 13, 15 in certain areas. Bottom line is, what I'm trying to say is that we've been spoiled by these enormous returns we have seen through COVID. And
well,
this is
normal. Yeah, it's not normal, but still, I mean, like if we look at Melbourne, for instance, 2007, a 12-month period, they had 23% growth. Now, post GFC, they also had a bump up in 29 for 19.6%. 2016 over, and this is actually talking to this period right now that you're talking about, where they had 13% growth from 2013 to 2017. So that's a lot longer of a time frame to have 13% growth rather than 23% in 12 months. But also the goal is of a property investor then is, my goal is to get the best property in the best market at the best price for my brief. So I'm trying to go out there and get the absolute best asset. And be it 15% or be it 25% or 50%, whatever it is, if it's the best market, you're going to ride whatever growth that it has, because you can't really predict. I mean, you guys are trying to predict it here, but there's no real way.
So you can predict it to some extent. Like you can say that, yes, there is data and metrics to look at it. So that is a prediction.
You can predict to higher levels of probability. I agree with that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a business. So you can do that. But I know what Joey's saying. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what is what I wanted to say? Sorry, it just escaped my mind. So you as anyone that's an investor, okay, you and this is one term that we should internalize and understand. And a lot of us know it. Some of us don't know it. It's opportunity cost. What is the cost of me investing in an area that's not going to deliver as much as some other areas that I could be invested into for the same brief? Okay, so you are trying to outpace, your erosion of purchasing power, whether it's through CPI index, debasement of currency, all of these other things. What you're doing with investing, you're building wealth, but you're also trying to outpace any other asset class that you can be investing into. Why would you invest into property if you can have a term deposit that's going to give you 15% return? You put it in a bank, it sits there, you don't need to look at this data nonsense, and it gives you 15%. Now, that is a fib essentially. No term deposit will give you 15%. But what I'm trying to say is that your opportunity cost is you trying to outcompete any other asset class, and also take account of leverage and the fact that you can leverage in property and not in other asset classes. But you're also trying to outcompete any other area that you could be potentially investing into for the same brief, which means that in some instances, you can be outcompeting everyone else with 7% growth, okay? Because that is what the market gives you at a particular stage in its cycle or at a particular macroeconomic condition. If the printer goes berserk again, for example, and you see, by the way, we are phenomenally restricted by the notion of affordability anyway. I think the gap between wage growth and property price growth has been the widest since 1970. So I don't see an instance in which a printer will go berserk and we're going to be making these, double-digit returns in 3 years. I don't think it's going to happen. But if it does happen, then in that instance, you again look for the fastest horse. So if everyone is making 15, you have to make 17 or 18, and you lay information that way. So, you are bound by what the market gives you is what I'm trying to say. And just because somebody made 30% in Perth in, 2021, it doesn't mean that you can do that today.
Exactly. So Townsville.
Booms, by the way, booms as well are going to look different. A boom in Melbourne is going to look different from a boom in Perth.
Yeah.
I don't think, and this is going to stay, people can quote me later, I don't think that Melbourne will get to a point where you will get 30% returns 3 years in a row, averaged annually. I don't think it will get there.
What do you mean, 10%, 10%, 10%, or 3, 6, 9? Like to be 90% overall? 30% overall or 90% overall?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be 90% overall.
No.
Like it was in Perth, essentially, yeah, Joe? Because it was around that for 4 years. Yeah. So Melbourne is not going to be like that. But is Melbourne a hotspot or a boom area, or will it be in the next 4 years? Yes. But this is a perfect example that highlights to you that not every boom looks the same, and not every boom retains the same. Now, the reason why Melbourne is a boom is because it will most probably return the most, compounded return in the next 4 years than other areas. But it will not be 90% in my view.
Yeah, because if you try and go from 600,000, the median of Melbourne now is just under that 800,000 roughly. It's about that, depending on where you're looking at. For that to go to, for that to even do 50%, you're going to 1.2 million. So imagine the middle sort of house that sells in Melbourne, which is imperfect, sells at 1.2 million. That's starting to get, which with the supply that's coming on around there, which is a question that people want to say. Rebecca's asked the question, and we'll sort of try and keep it to a couple of minutes because it's the question that was on everybody's lips. And then we'll quickly throw to Townsville, and then we'll finish off briefly because I know we want to get you out of here on time. She said, "So what is the current fastest horse?" And my answer to that, and your answer to that, to Matija, is going to be, well, what is the brief? Like, what is your risk?
Exactly. For who?
Yeah, because if you had a very high risk tolerance and were comfortable with investing in an area that may not see consistent growth, maybe that's a Darwin.
Correct.
But then if I'm not saying that's going to be the area that'll grow the most, but that could be the one that could absolutely skyrocket. But then it could also just sort of stagnate and then do nothing after 3 years. So how
much money you've got?
Yeah. What was the lady's name, by the way? Was it a lady? Rebecca. Yeah, Rebecca. Now, as Jeff has rightly pointed out, the fastest horse depends on your brief, which is what makes property investing beautiful. Okay. You don't have to be chasing these hotspots that everyone is talking about. All you need to chase and understand is what does your brief provide you with? Okay, what is your budget, your price point, investment time horizon? When do you want to exit the area, extract equity, and what is your risk profile? And these are the questions that we usually ask about every brief. And now, depending on how you answer those questions, you're going to have a subset of, fast and slow horses under that brief. Now, again, as Joe has mentioned, what is your budget? Like if you have 400K to spend, then your fastest horse is Broken Hill. Now, that fastest horse might return 3% annually, but it is the fastest horse, at least the one with least risk. I'm throwing figures out there because I haven't looked at Broken Hill recently, but I'm painting the picture around. Now, if you have 750K to spend, then you're looking at a completely different subset of areas. Now, because you have 750K to spend, you're not looking at areas that are 350 to 750. No, you need to put a reasonable disparity and a range between 550, 600 to 750, because if you go lower, you're essentially including a mixed bag of areas under your brief that have completely two different economic underpinnings, okay? So you need to look for, it needs to be an apples for apples comparison is what I'm trying to say. Now, as Jeff has rightly pointed out, there are certain areas in Darwin where you have very high socioeconomics, you have very, very high levels of affordability. You have dramatically reducing supply and demand is improving short term, and it looks set to general. And by the way, Darwin in general has been stagnating in the same way, same as Perth and I would say Townsville for a decade. Now, there are some areas that might give you that exorbitant growth, but Jeff has actually mentioned something that I do agree with. And for example, H-tag might buy in some areas in Darwin, but I'm not going to hold it for a decade. Why? Because there's a higher probability of volatility thereafter. So what I'll do is, again, it depends on your brief, but if your brief doesn't allow you plenty of options, and let's say the only option that you have is Darwin or some Djolic or Zuccoli, for example, then you will look at that area and say, okay, what are the concerns about this area? Okay. If I look at Djolic and Zuccoli, the concerns are long-term, volatility essentially within this area. So then I adjust my strategy and then I say, okay, I'll buy in Djolic or Zuccoli, but I hold it 5 years. At the 5-year mark, I'm going to sit down, reassess the area, see where it is. If it starts going all fuzzy on me, I'm going to exit. But I would have made 80% by that mark, So
that's not to say you will in those areas, but these are purely examples. Similar.
Exactly. It's pure example. It depends on your brief and what you're trying to say. What you're trying to do. And there always needs to be, by the way, to find the fastest horse. The nature of definition, the fastest horse means that there's a race. In a race, not only one area is racing, which is why I always find that interesting when people send me a text and say, "What do you think about Camden, for example?" In comparison to what? You can't just be looking at one area.
Yeah, love it.
Sorry,
mate, you're on fire. Love the passion. How good is it? And Rebecca said,
it's crucial because it can be really detrimental. So that's why I always talk about it.
We should have went to Townsville first because I'm just mindful of your time because people want to know. Let's chuck out a couple of areas, or maybe we should do Matija's pick. And we'll give you a bit of a brief. We'll come back with that to Melbourne and we'll throw some questions. So I want to say, is Melbourne the area where people are most interested in looking at? And I suppose we'll just say probably yes. And this is where Sasha's thing comes into play. You can see my chart that I'm sharing.
No, we're not sharing just yet. We're going to dive into that. Before we do that, we just got to jump to our sponsor, but then we'll dive into Townsville and then some of the hot spots in Victoria.
Warm spots.
Everywhere you look, someone else is making money in property except for you. Your mate, he just bought a house. It's already gone up $100,000. There's some bloke on Facebook. He's bragging about pulling in a 7% rental yield. Meanwhile, you're stuck scrolling real estate and domain, confused as hell and having no idea about where to start. Or maybe you're that mate that's got $100,000 in equity. You have a few properties under your belt, but you feel stuck. You're unsure about how to scale without over-leveraging and not knowing what the next right move is. So why does it feel like everyone else has some kind of secret that you're missing out on? It's because they do. There's a reason some people keep stacking properties while others sit on the sidelines stacking excuses. There's a reason why some investors buy under market value while others pay too much. There's a reason why investors know the hot spots before there's any heat. And there's a reason that some people build $150,000 in passive income while others just spend years thinking about it. And it comes down to knowledge. And that's exactly why Jeff Miles and I, Joe Tucker, created the Level Up Property course to hand you the exact step-by-step process that we've used to buy over $100 million worth of property in today's market. We've built Australia's largest property investment community with over 80,000 members, and we help everyday investors secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity, all without wasting years of their life trying to figure it out the hard way. Making an uneducated decision on the biggest purchase in your life is just gambling with your future.
Stop it. Get some help.
And this isn't just another how to buy property course. Let's be clear though, this course isn't free. What and neither should it be. This is our life's work. We've spent over 100 hours each on this course alone. Oh, babe. Okay, video number 3. Number 4 with million does... Fuck. Done. We've got decades of experience, millions of dollars in deals distilled into a repeatable process that you can take away for yourself. If you're looking for free advice, there's plenty of noise out there. You can go and find that if you'd like. But if you want real, actionable, step-by-step guided process that works in today's market, then this investment is going to change everything for you. By the time that you finish this course, you will have full confidence. You'll have every tool that you need to build an amazing portfolio if you act on it, right? Which is why we have mentoring built in. So we kick you up the butt to make sure that you're kicking your goals. So the real question is, how much longer are you going to watch everyone else making money in property before you jump in and start playing the property game properly? Because the sooner you start winning.
Like that. Jeff will jump back in soon. Okay. So let's dive into Townsville, mate, because I think this is one of those interesting markets where it's very polarizing at the moment. It's like, okay, cool, it's grown quite nicely. Has this gone beyond? So yeah, share your screen now. Yeah, we can see it. How do you think of, actually, can you just give us the macro of how you think about Townsville?
Can you see my
You can see Djolic. Yep, we can see Townsville City. Yep.
Yeah. So I see 26% in the last year. I mean, interesting. And this is LGA level, yeah. So, I mean, again, it all depends, you know, what your brief is, and this is what I say to people. Like, if, for example, they have the serviceability, you know, to purchase again in the next 1 or 2 years, which means that the equity extraction time frame from the initial investment should be, you know, 1 or 2 years, then essentially Townsville is a suitable investment, because I do believe there are certain areas in there that have long-term steam, that have great socioeconomics, even though they've actually grown substantially in the last couple of years or even the last 5. I do think there's still something left on the table. And let's not forget that, you know, everything goes through cycles. You know, you'll have cycles of boom, cycles of stagnation, and cycles of boom again. So I do think that Townsville, again, provides good opportunities for those individuals who are looking to extract equity in the next 1 or 2 years, or generate 20 or 30% growth target within that time frame, so they can leverage into additional purchases. And there are certain areas that have, I mean, obviously, when we buy an area that's going to give us a growth target of 20 to 30% in 1 or 2 years, you know, we shouldn't. And this is the problem that I always talk about. I say, you know, if you're investing in a hotspot and this is what your brief dictates, that's all good and well. Now, make sure that the area that you buy within does not compromise your long-term growth just for the sake of the short-term growth, because you might end up holding a liability for 15 years. So make sure you assess the long-term potential of the area as well. Coming back to Townsville, I think that some areas do, some suburbs do have them, but it would suit a particular brief. And also, you'll struggle to find an asset that you want within that area. You know, this is what I find, you know, like you want an equity extraction time for a growth target of, you know, 30% in 2 years, but then you're unhappy about the room layout, or maybe the room should be 2 meters larger, or things like that. It just doesn't work that way. You won't potentially find the right asset, but you'll get that momentum that you need, but it needs to suit your brief, essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
One of the I'm back. I've made myself a cup of tea, but I want to know. Thanks for going through this, Matt. Mount Low was an area of particular interest. Now I know that Mount Low is an area that maybe a little bit more of supply potentially. I could be wrong there. I'm just picturing Townsville. So because that was one that I did a poll on this, and you saw the poll. So if you go, I reckon you have to, you're getting there. So what's so just looking, that looks at quite a high buy-in price. The yield is already low as well, but it must have a fairly high USAT, because if you look at that.
Look at that. That's 23% growth. Data confidence is high. Let me just look at a lot of spending, infrastructure spending, which is great. So it has grown in 10. Yeah, that's fine. Let me just see where it sits. So the GRC, so it has been growing substantially in the last decade in comparison to a time frame before that. Which again, every time I analyze an area, I put either a cross or a question mark against something, or a tick, and then I come back to it later to see its significance and whether I'm willing to compromise on it. So when I look at an area and I see that it's been pumping for 3, 5, and 10 years, in comparison to 3, 5, and 10 years before that, knowing that nothing is perpetual, I put a question mark against this long-term futures theme, okay? Now, again, it has to suit its brief. Now, URSAT is 6, very high rent-to-owner ratio, which could, again, be either an indication of, investor saturation, or it's that kind of a market. Now, rent-to-owner ratio to me is also a supply indicator, and could potentially pose risk, especially for this price point in Townsville, which is 760. So what do I mean by that? Let's say in the next 4 years, we see interest rate reductions, or whatever it is, But 4 years after that, you'll see increases. And when interest rates increase, they usually increase at a faster pace than do rents. So people who are holding onto these assets might struggle to actually maintain the assets. So they're going to start disposing, which is going to increase supply and potentially reduce price. Potentially have a negative effect on price if it's not met with the appropriate demand. So another sort of question mark that I will get back to later. It still remains very affordable, especially for this price point, which is essentially a good. So it's under 30 years.
Because I noticed the line check. What is that? The 30-year line, is it? Is that why?
Yeah, that's a 30-year line. Yeah. So essentially, it's still at 750K. In the context of things, that still makes it very affordable. It's at 750K typical price, and yet the affordability index is below 30 years to own. Now,
the people there can push the prices up.
Yeah, that's right. So people still have, and considering the socioeconomics are relatively high, which is a 6. There's still long-term steam available in that area, even though that's why I say it's a question mark that when I see an area or an indicator that is negative, let's say the fact that it's been pumping in the last decade, and I put a question mark against it, I go back and I look at affordability and URSAT, and I still say, okay, it has some room to grow. It has some steam left because it's still very affordable for relatively high affluence. Now,
whole period's quite low as well, but that could just be.
No, whole period is 7.21. It's not its neutral range. It's decent. Now, what you see is severely reducing supply, both long-term and short-term. Building approvals, how many? 29, nothing major. The fact that the supply is reducing phenomenally, these building approvals that are going to come to the market, they're not going to affect the supply equation that much. Now, what you see, guys, is, for example, and this is what I said before, so you see both long-term and short-term vacancy rates increasing. Now, this is a problem, and it's especially a problem. So currently the vacancy rates are sitting at 2.36. Now, the current vacancy rates are neutral. However, when we look at the long-term and short-term trend, they're both increasing. In the context of a lot of renter-to-owner ratios, higher renter-to-owner ratio, that to me is a great proxy for investor saturation. Okay?
In that suburb of Townsville, yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, you see the short-term demand weakening. So you see long-term days on market dropping, but you see a divergence between long-term and short-term, okay? So you see short-term demand weakening, i.e. short-term days on market increasing. Now, when you combine this into a story, and let's create a narrative, what do we see? We see a vacancy rates increasing phenomenally, both short-term and long-term when it comes to the trend, which is a great proxy for investor saturation. On top of that, investor saturation, I mean, a lot of the tail end purchasing that are happening in the last year are mainly the investors driving the price growth up, and you see a lot of investors participating in the market. Now, when you combine that with a very high renter to owner ratio, that also is a good, triangulation for me to tell me to affirm that my thinking is correct. Now, on top of that, if I layer that, the short-term demand is also weakening. And by the way, it's sitting at 55-day, 3-month rolling average. If you really want to think of a hotspot, hotspots have anywhere between below 30 or 25 days on market for a single month. This one is sitting at 55, 3-month rolling average. Okay, so you see the short-term demand weakening. So it's losing demand short-term, which means that if I go back to the GRC, I would say that the projection that the GRC provides, although this is just, essentially an algorithmic representation of the previous curve, I do recognize that this is semi-correct. This area will in 2025 still potentially generate, a total of 20% return, and it's going to start subsiding, because you're going to see too many. I mean, if I'm an investor, why would I buy in this market if the vacancy rates are high? Not only are they high, but the trends are also substantially increasing short-term and long-term, which means that my holding costs increase. Because we investors, we only a couple of parameters that we are analyzing. If I'm going to, yes, I'll see the substantial growth, but if my holding cost increases, I have to balance the two. So essentially this area gets downgraded on the list. So bottom line is what I'm trying to say is that, yes, the area will grow in the future. And now, if your brief is I want to extract 20% in the next 2 years, this area might be suitable for you. Okay. Yeah. Now I would have to compare that. Yeah, I would have to compare against the other options. It might be suitable for you, but after that, you're going to see stagnation. Now, what I like about the long-term prospects of this area is that you have relatively high socioeconomics and the area is still relatively affordable, which means that when it goes through a process of stagnation for the next, let's say, 5 years after it subsides from a hotspot, the affordability is going to even more improve, and it's going to have room for another hotspot cycle at that later end in the future. But I have to set the expectation with the user for them to understand that. A lot of people, you have, people being put into Mount Lyell, for example, and let's say, I'm a buyer's agent, I buy for them, and I put them in Mount Lyell, they generate 20%, and they say, oh, Matt's a great buyer's agent. If I haven't explained to them that area might potentially stagnate thereafter, but it has potential long-term because of its high levels of affordability and improving socioeconomics, I actually done that client a disservice, because what they're going to find out is that 3 years into holding the asset, everything has evaporated and they haven't extracted the equity. Yeah. So it is all horses for courses, essentially,
Yeah. But you're not saying this is for this suburb particularly in Townsville, not overall.
No.
Yeah, not for every suburb there.
I could say the uncomfortable thing that I would be very cautious of Townsville into 2027, but I didn't say that.
2027, yeah.
Why 2027?
Well, for me, a ship doesn't turn, and maybe you might disagree on this, and I'm just mindful. Do we want to throw the question after this and to get you sort of finished by?
Yeah. Sorry. Ask me.
What I was going to say is the ship typically doesn't turn in 1 year. It'll sort of take that 6, 9 to 12 months. So 2026, you might see that 10, 15%, and then maybe in 2027 you sort of start to see that 5 to 10%, maybe. That's what I'm sort of saying. So
well exactly. That's why it's a curve down. It starts subsiding. Yeah. It doesn't happen. You're right. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Essentially, we'll get 2 years for it to revert back to a mean or whatever that 5% is. Not a mean in 2026. So 2025 might potentially see 20% return on end of 2025, and then it's going to drop substantially to 5%. Now that's also rapid.
15% on 750,000 is still $111,000, $112,000.
Absolutely.
And 5% on $800,000. I don't know what that would be. I feel 40, like
easy. Half of 10%, which is 80,000. Joe.
Quick maths. 40,000.
No, absolutely. Now, but it comes down to Joe. It comes down to again the fastest horse. Is that the best option? Now,
yes.
When we're analyzing Mount Lyell, is Mount Lyell first and foremost, will it give us the most return in the first 2 years if our equity extraction time frame is 2 years? And then also after that, when it reverts back to the mean, will it have the highest mean average, essentially? Sorry, mean average. Will it have the highest mean, So it's like the analysis. But you're right, correct. 5% on an 800K property is still a great return.
Yeah. Let's jump to questions. Because I want to respect your time and I want to respect the people that are not watching State of Origin right now because
I've teased you on this about Melbourne. We'll have to get you back for a session or something. There'll have to be something in the pipeline there, Matija. There will be something, Matija.
Yeah.
So somebody said there is one question here about, and this is a very macro question. So I know you may not know the ins and outs of this, but somebody said, is Melbourne going to boom with plenty of land everywhere? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think and this is I wouldn't say typical question, because if I say typical, it will mean that it's meaningless. It's actually meaningful, but it is a typical question. Now, the fact that something has land, I would assume that the gentleman or the lady that's asking this is assuming negative or assuming price stagnation from oversupply. Now, for oversupply to happen, you need to have introduction of supply outpacing the increases in demand. So just because there's vacant land out there doesn't mean that you are inadvertently going to have oversupply and demand is going to be weak. Okay, that's one thing. Now, you do have vacant land in areas such as Melton, for example, and a lot of building approvals happening there. But what is interesting about that area is that area is seeing the highest population growth in the last year, and I think has been so in recent times. And I think projections are sitting at around 6.5 to 7% growth. Okay. Now, if you do a simple calculation and you see if there's 2.5 to 3 people per household in Melton or any other area, let's say, what I'm trying to say is that if you're doing this essentially oversupply equation, look at the amount of people that, potentially will move into that area. Look at the forecasting for population growth. Look at the current building approvals. See how many people are per household, so you can, essentially determine how much population will be housed by those building approvals. And then look if there's a shortfall. And what is interesting is that in most of these areas, there is a shortfall. Okay. Now, will I buy in an area or invest in an area that has 1,000 building approvals? Of course not. Which inadvertently means that the fact that Melbourne has vacant land, it doesn't mean that, there's a bit of a common sense element here that has to be exercised. And by simply asking, vacant land, there's a lot of vacant land in Melbourne, what do you think? That means that Melbourne will grow uniformly or will not grow uniformly, So so bottom line is, yes, you might see a suburb. I'll give you an example. Okay. So I bought in Gregory Hills 15 years ago. Okay. Gregory Hills is
a bit of land out there, but yeah, you would have done exceptionally well.
Yeah. Gregory Hills has increased, 250% in a decade or thereabouts, whatever, Now Castrin Fields, which is within the same LGA, has seen negative 40% growth in that same time frame. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that we've spoken about the fastest horse. One horse is faster, one horse is slower. So some areas might suffer from a potential oversupply, and it's a potential. And by the way, for something to go from vacant land to building approvals to release to then, all of the developers do not release everything at once because they have issues with cash flow. And I discussed this before.
And they control the supply and demand, and they know the demand side of things so that they can continue to push the prices to get more. It just takes a little bit longer for them. There are stage releases.
In all honesty, Joe, by the way, you'll assume the developers know what they're doing. Now, most of them, I wouldn't say most of them, definitely. You do have a stage where some area is overdeveloped, like Fraser. What's the Fraser? It is in Melton. Fraser Rise.
Fraser Rise. Yeah.
I think it has like 1,000 building approvals. What I'm thinking about these developers is like, man, why would you develop it if you already have 1,000 building approvals? Are you thinking? So obviously some of them are not thinking, but bottom line is
900.
Yeah, Fraser Rise might have a struggle. And again, it all comes down to timeframes. Fraser Rise has the highest population growth. There's a lot of infrastructure investment, long-term potential, great for the suburb. But if my brief requires me to generate a growth target of 30% in the next 3 or 4 years, Fraser Rise is not going to give me that because it's going to have an influx of supply coming to the market constantly. but other areas will do well. Bottom line is that, you know, there's heterogeneity there in the sense that, you know, you want every market is going to see different levels of growth. And just because there's vacant land, it doesn't equal oversupply.
What?
I love your work.
What was that word? Heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity, which means the same. Hetero means the same.
No, it means hetero means different.
Oh, different. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Homogeneity means same.
Homo hetero. Yeah.
Yeah, as in like, yeah.
Mate, I want to
say. By the way, I might not be pronouncing that because of my English kind of.
No, I knew exactly what you meant. I just
I've never heard of the word. That's all.
For anybody who has enjoyed this session, share it on. Give us that 5-star on Spotify team, because we've unpacked how booms actually work, and we want to get this message out, this podcast out to as many people. Super passionate about this, so jump on there, give us that 5 stars, and over to you, Joe. Where do we go from here?
Well, I don't know. Where do we go from here? There was a little code that we had that gave people access to the hashtag platform. Because, Matija, how do people get more Matija in their life? I love having you on. It's been incredible. You're always...
beware what you wish for, essentially, is well, essentially, I spend most of my time in our mastermind community. So, you know, they can join us there. There are certain levels in mastermind community, essentially freemium levels and paid. When I say paid, if you subscribe to the hashtag platform, you'll get access to the mastermind community as well, where I do the coaching bit of things. So, yeah, there is a code, but guys, I mean, we had the code. You have the code there, yeah? That's great.
What is it? Ozprop_20. If they do Ozprop_30, do they get 30% off? No.
I don't
think it works that way.
Yeah. That way, as Jeff has said, I mean, how long is a piece of string? You can just type in 100, you know? Pleasure. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So, you'll find me in Mastermind, essentially. I do a lot of this chatting in Mastermind, and I rarely actually, less time do I spend on Facebook and LinkedIn, which is not that great, but you got to pick your battles, I guess.
Thank you, man. I appreciate you. You absolutely nailed it, and you're so passionate, which is amazing. I appreciate you coming on, and I'm sure we'll definitely get you on again soon.
No, absolutely. And guys, honestly, apologies. As I said, you know, I love talking about this. We could go until 11. If it's just, but you know, I have the kids in the next room, and my mum is there, and I don't want to leave her with hot potatoes, essentially trying to juggle. So
you've shared incredible value here, mate.
They're running around. Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
But
thank you very much.
We'll tee up another one about Melbourne if you like, and I really appreciate you inviting me. By the way,
it's good to have you, mate. We'll catch up soon. Let's go buy a property, guys. Good luck.
Boom.
Cheers, guys.
Boom property. Boom.